So the purpose of my project this semester was to inform pre-service and in-service educators about teaching astronomy to young early education students. I used meaningful learning in the classroom, and I made a mini unit composed of 3 lessons in phase 1, 2, and 3. Phase 1 is about stars and their constellation patterns. Phase 2 is about the sun and getting to know the contents and physical features of the sun. And the 3rd lesson was about planets and the moon. Because early education is so important for students to learn primary skills in the classroom to extend into primary grades, I wanted to teach the importance of deep, meaningful learning, so it goes beyond the concrete to further the abstract knowledge for science education, as well as teaching a consistency in those differences. So this semester, I am placed at Bunch Montessori School in Fort Wayne Community Schools District. I was in a pre-K and kindergarten classroom with a mixture of ages ranging from 3 to 6 years old, all at once. The Montessori learning philosophy is one which values individualized learning, independence, and practical life skills so students can move on and further their education at their own rate. And in my classroom, every developmental level is welcome. There are students with special needs. There's also IEPs implemented, as well as behavior management. My participants in my research included 2 P3s, or representing as 3-year-olds, 2 P4s, which are 4-year-olds, and 2 kindergartners, one ages 5 and 6. They were all mixed into one subgroup to collect data for the mini unit which I created. The timeline of my research: the unit of study started in last fall, where I created the unit lessons in phase 1, 2, and 3. And then I started gathering data this past month, implementing lessons in my student teaching placement at the Montessori level. I had to make very many modifications to originally when I wrote them because they were not to the Montessori level. So I had to add bunches of Montessori materials related to the education that they are currently being taught, as well as materials for them to succeed. Today I'm going to be primarily focusing on the first lesson which I wrote, and it is about stars and their constellations. I'm going to be dissecting each part of the lesson which I taught, the data which I collected, what the lesson looked like, and how the students understood it. So first, the objective for this lesson was, by the end of the lesson, students will be able to explain that stars are different patterns in the sky with at least 80% accuracy, as evidenced by their responses with a Montessori matching works. The standards in each unit were composed of 3 standards. 1 Indiana State Standard, as described as the first one, which states using observations of the sun, moon, and stars were used to describe patterns that can be predicted. And the next generation science standard, Performance Expectations, with the same one being that they use observations of the sun, moon, and stars to describe patterns that can be predicted. The reason which I wrote this lesson for a first grade standard is because currently the Indiana State Standards does not have an astronomy standard to match this unit. So I wanted to comprise it and enrich the learning environment for the students. In each lesson, students were investigating critical thinking questions. The first lesson, they were analyzing and responding to the learning with 3 important questions. The first one was, how do we know stars are in the sky? So besides looking at the sky at night, how do we know that they are there? What are the physical features of stars that we can find out? What exactly are constellations? How do we know that they are patterns that can be more than just looking at a star map? And why do they make patterns? Why do we know they make patterns? And the materials which I used were specifically focused and differentiated around the Montessori matching constellation work, which I created with the teacher I'm with currently. I had an astronomy PowerPoint, which had multiple star maps and major astronomy constellations, and the Big Dipper and Little Dipper, and a Montessori rug. And typically in the Montessori learning environment, every student has a rug which they use their work. So the rug represents the learning environment, and every time a student is currently being taught a lesson, the students need to respond to their learning by tapping the teacher's shoulder so they're not being interrupted. So that's the root of the Montessori learning in this specific lesson. So how did the lesson look? The beginning of each of my lessons took place in a social discussion format. So each of the students were asking and answering questions where we're asking about their schema and their background knowledge. So the question that I asked in this lesson was, what do you know about stars? Can you tell me? And we are going to write them down. So the students made a discussion chart with me, and we discussed their background knowledge about stars. And then I wrote them down, and then the students and I discussed it. The middle of the lesson, I gave students a star map and asked what they knew. I collected data from what they knew and what they didn't know. The teacher, me, and the students discussed the star map and other major constellations, such as Orion, the Little Dipper, the Big Dipper, Ursa Major, and Ursa Minor. In the ending, students were introduced to two new constellations of the Little Dipper and Big Dipper. They were given a picture and a label at the bottom, and they extended their work into the matching and sorting philosophy of the Montessori framework. And then when they did that, all of the students had to do that, and I had to assess their knowledge about whether they performed well or they didn't perform well. And once that was completed, we talked about the differences and similarities between each constellation on the star map. So how well did students understand the content in each phase of the lesson? So at the beginning, many students provided many answers to what they knew about stars. The younger students mainly provided answers and explanations that we can see stars in the night. And that's the basis of the concrete understanding they knew. They couldn't extend their abstract thinking into classifying the star as a sun, which much of my older students could do. The older students understood that the sun is our closest star to us right now. None of my younger students or 3-year-olds could do that. And finally, the older students were able to understand, we see them at night also, but extend their understanding by applying it to the lesson itself and their explanations. The middle of the lesson, students were able to understand and point out differences they saw in the constellation and star maps. So we noticed different length patterns, the shapes, the sizes, in the Little Dipper and Big Dipper. Students also understood that stars connect and make patterns in the night sky. So beyond just seeing the dots in the sky, which were much of their responses, we could connect each of those dots to make patterns. And we can see the pattern in lengths and the squares and the shapes and sizes. The ending of the lesson, students were assessed, as explained before, on whether they could match and sort in the Montessori framework, the Little Dipper and Big Dipper. Many of them did struggle at first because they were not aware of how to inform their understanding of what they knew about stars to connect to other constellations. But overall, the students all did well and they did succeed. When asked if they knew the differences between the Little Dipper and Big Dipper beyond just connecting and sorting and matching, they could tell me. It was the size, it was the shape, it was the length. And also they were able to classify another major constellation and its part, the Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, which I was very, very pleased. So, in each of my lessons, I made a results and data chart because we were focusing on core objectives found on the left-hand side in the criteria part about what they learned and what they did not learn and their degree of how they learned. So my first learning objective that I wanted all of my students to learn was that stars can make pictures called constellations. 66% were meeting an understanding as represented by a plus and a dash. 16% exceeded an understanding as represented by 2 pluses, and 16% of my whole subgroup are still developing in their understanding. A lot of this is the 3-year-old age group because it is one of my constraints in my project because they're so young and they don't have the schema behind this stuff. My next learning objective was stars are tiny dots in the sky. This seems very simple for us to understand, but some of them can't grow that awareness beyond the concrete abstract knowledge of it. 33% of my students are still developing an understanding as represented by 2 dashes. 50% were meeting an understanding for this learning objective as represented by a plus and dash, and the remaining 16% are exceeding in this understanding as represented by 2 pluses. My third objective was we can see stars in the night sky. I wanted them to understand that we can see them in the night sky, but I wanted them to explain why we can see them. Most of them could explain why we can see them, but some of them were still developing the schema behind it. 50% of my students are meeting an understanding for this learning objective as represented by a plus and dash, and the other 50% are exceeding an understanding, represented by 2 pluses. The next learning objective would lead into the next lesson, which is about the sun, and that the sun can be classified as a star. 66% of them are still developing an understanding as represented by 2 dashes. 16% are exceeding an understanding as represented by 2 pluses, and the remaining of my students represent the other 16% as meeting an understanding with a plus and a dash. And the last learning objective that I took anecdotal records and observations on was that stars make different patterns in the sky. 50% exceeded an understanding, 16% were meeting an understanding, and the remaining 16% are still developing in their understanding. Here are some pictures of which we did. On the left is a picture of our discussion format, which we did, and their responses. Much of the responses were stars are shiny, they're pointy, they're dots in the sky, that the sun is a star, that they are hot, which I'm not really sure why they were saying that to me, still trying to figure that out, and that they are little. On the right is the Montessori framework learning format, which we did at the ending of the lesson, where the students had the picture and the label at the bottom, and just the picture where they needed to match to the constellation and the label at the bottom. Here are some of my students working on it. We both started off with an individual learning basis where they individually did it, and then the older students were helping the younger students. So they were scaffolding their learning by letting the younger students being helped by the older ones. Some of these are both of the younger students and the older student helping them. This is the second lesson, and this is the same framework as the discussion format, and we talked about the sun, and their responses vary from the sun being close to us, it is a ball of gas, which I was very impressed by that, and that it is shiny and beautiful. And the Venn diagram, which was used as an assessment tool, where we compared the stars from the previous lesson and the sun in this current lesson. And they found that to be similar, that they are both stars in the sky and they are only there at nighttime, as different to the stars and the sun being only there during the day. And this is our last lesson, which we talked about the moon and planets. And the discussion format is on the left again. And we talked about what they knew about the planets and the moon. And they said they both spin. They both move with the sun and around the sun. We took a poll on the right about which one we thought was true, if the planets moved around the sun or with the sun. And most of them agreed they moved around the sun. And which one was closest to the sun? We have planets and the poles listed. And the furthest planets away from the sun too, where they were given pictures and diagrams. So beyond the research aspect of this project, I did have a few constraints. The first one being that much of my early education students were so focused on learning through a rote memory lens. They weren't able to grasp the critical thinking and problem-solving aspects of this project. They couldn't move beyond the worry of, I need to constantly memorize every single thing I'm given, and move beyond to that abstract thinking of, oh, I can critically analyze and think about what I'm thinking about and problem solve through this. So that was my first constraint. And if that were to be changed, we would have had more lessons to address that concern and constraint. And my second constraint was the 3-year-old age group, as explained before. And the reason why is because they lack prior knowledge and schema to build their knowledge and responses to the questions given in the lesson. And if I could educate them more and do a few introductory lessons about each of the concepts in the lessons, it would have been a better experience for them. They could have been educated more and could have had more schema behind it. And finally, my third and final constraint includes not having individualized education goals for each student. A lot of my students started out learning through a rote memory lens, and they couldn't move beyond the concrete to the abstract. And because of that, I believe that if I had more time, I could adjust and modify and differentiate for each student to move towards the abstract learning of that goal. The first person who supports the literature in this discussion, which I provided, is a person called Zaki, and the research behind his research informs that early childhood education is important for the learning astronomy community in science because it helps students understand size and shape discrimination and physical features and characteristics of internal and astronomical phenomena. My research is supported by this because it helps students in the needs of support of understanding size and shape discrimination of objects, as well as the ability to describe physical features such as things in the sky. It's important for the students to connect both what they learned in this lesson and use it in other content areas. And that is much of what Zaki provided in its research. My second point argues that it is important for students to learn astronomy because it helps them develop observational skills in scientific inquiry and literacy. And the need for students in the early age group is definitely understood because it needs to meet a goal of helping them develop observation skills and prediction skills. Because when they move to kindergarten, they need to be able to observe things and describe physical features. And those are important skills for the astronomy concepts which I educated them on. My next researcher, a person named Lou, informed and found that in-service teachers who use concept mapping as a thematic tool really gave a great system of learning for others, and they addressed their own certain misconceptions about star formation and methodology behind the sun before they gave the lessons, and it helped provide a Piagetian learning style, and it gave them a research goal and tool to help them adjust their teaching practices and to improve their own misconceptions before they taught the specific learning goals. My last researcher, which I use in my research, is a person called Kreider, and it is about teaching visual literacy in the astronomy classroom. Kreider argues two main points relevant to my research for my honors project, and it argues that visual learning in astronomy and the development of visual literacy is important because it helps students understand visual images, tools, diagrams, and plots to further their education in other areas such more than science. So the visual literacy and the visual mediums which they learned in this research project help them learn in more ways than one, consistently bettering their background knowledge of the content as well. So the last question in the last slide is the question which I was trying to answer the entire semester, and it was, how does this research inform teaching practices? Well, the first point which I found to be most relevant, and as I just explained, is that students can learn in multiple versatile ways, more than one at once. And even though beyond just the visual aspect and the kinesthetic and tactile aspect of my research, I found that they were able to learn at the auditory and the visual learning aspect and the kinesthetic aspect as well, all at once, to enhance their learning experience and to provide me more data. The second point which informs teaching practices is that the assessment of data from all of my research in figures 1.1, 2.1, and 3.1 support more ways to help struggling learners in the science education field. And it helps them it helps me as a teacher ask more critical questions to promote thinking and moving beyond the rote memorization of the young learners. So to provide those critical thinking and problem-solving questions helps them learn more deep, meaningful routes so they can have better learning. And the third point, which I think is most important, is that it helps teachers teach an appreciation for astronomy. It helps students to go beyond their rote memorization skills to grasp the concrete and move to the abstract. And it helps them feel that they can appreciate the universe around them. It teaches an appreciation for astronomy, and even though the early education field of today does not have the awareness and the needs to provide astronomy education, I feel as if this research informed my own teaching practices going into the field of education to make awareness for that. And the final point, which I can inform the teaching practices of pre-service and in-service educators, is that teachers who use critical thinking questions and more age-appropriate language and classroom discussions can enhance the early education experience for students. Using critical thinking questions to promote thinking and age-appropriate language will help students grasp the knowledge and the concepts in these lessons in the astronomy education and promote their understanding of the abstract concepts in astronomy. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.
It's time for questions. If you guys have any questions.
Thank you, Kaelyn. This was very impressive. I have a question for you. Since you said that you based your teaching methods and your research based on the Montessori teaching, right? Their teaching methods. What challenges do you, well, one, why did you pick a Montessori school? And if you said that, I'm so sorry for missing it. And the second part is, what challenges do you think you might have going into an elementary school, teaching the topic or topics, but not in a Montessori school system?
Well, Montessori is very different because students work at their own rate, and the elementary schools do not do that. So I think if I were to teach all the lessons that I did teach with the Montessori materials, it would have to be adapted as far as providing worksheets and other materials that former curriculums and curriculums that elementary schools use, because Montessori doesn't use a specific curriculum that elementary schools do use. So that will be a first challenge, and then the second challenge would be the age group. It would all depend on what class I'm in and what age group I'm in to support the
variety of different ages in that.
Yeah, so those are the two challenges I would face. Yeah.
You said that their learning might have been affected by some of the critical, not being able to have that critical thinking. Did you ever consider, or maybe in the future if you do this again, or future studies, consider teaching them critical thinking and just taking a day to show those strategies that they could use to critical think and how that might affect their learning with the constellations and everything?
Yeah, certainly. That's a good idea. I think that's a good tool for them to understand more of the concepts in my lessons, which I did teach. And a lot of my older ones, specifically my 5- and 6-year-old, were able to provide answers that were very thought through and show their problem-solving skills, but I think the younger ones lack that understanding and ability to do. So I think going through and teaching them the tools about, here's what you need to look for in questioning, this is how you phrase questions, how you phrase your responses, this supports the research behind it. But I think that's a good idea. Same with teaching the younger kids the basic concepts of astronomy. They had no idea going into it, so definitely.
So in looking at how you developed these units, the question of rote learning versus critical thinking, I know one of the things that we talked about was how you were going to be scaffolding and helping them to develop those critical thinking skills. And so I just want you to share a little bit. I know you did quite a bit of this. How were you helping them, trying to help them transition into becoming critical thinkers through doing these astronomy activities?
Well, one way was giving them the opportunity to go back and do the lesson themselves. We had a specific lesson. This first lesson, which I overviewed, we had materials which I created, and they can go back on their own time, in their own work time, and work on it themselves. That's one way. And also the other way is to sit with them one-on-one and to watch them do the lesson by themselves. Because I was teaching a whole group format, Montessori is not about that. They usually do one-on-one. So that's another way which I could help them develop and certainly observe their critical thinking questions and their responses, which were supported in what I did. And finally, the other way, which I did try my best to do with my younger ones, it was a very daunting task, was asking them to sum up something they learned in each lesson. Just tell me one thing you learned. A lot of it was very concrete, very close to concrete. They couldn't tell me their critical thinking and analyzing skills and their responses. So that's another way which I did.
All right, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you very much, Kaelyn.
Thank you.